And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this week disturbance bringing an area of light snow and snow showers from the Arctic coast right on down into the central interior, then back down along and west of the Alaska Range there into the Kuskokwim Valley. Otherwise, mostly cloudy, light winds, weak high pressure here extending from the eastern Aleutians into Bristol Bay. And maybe an increase in the clouds here later tonight into the Matanuska or into the Susitna Valley and possibly Cook Inlet. Dry to the east, mostly clear along the North Gulf Coast from Prince William Sound, clearing out over the northern Panhandle. And showers are pretty much over down in the south. Out to the west, strong front, big storm out there with the low center tracking north and northeastward there across Russia, pushing that front into the Bering Strait. During the day tomorrow for high wind warnings and coastal flood advisories, or coastal flood warnings for St. Lawrence Island, coastal flood warnings all the way down along the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast, as well as up onto the western and actually central Arctic coast for later on into Monday over that way. And snow and blowing snow on the increase, winter storm warnings out here up along the northwest coast with high wind warnings gusting 75 miles an hour there for Point Hope, Cape Lisburne. Look for gusts to 65 miles an hour. St. Lawrence Island, much warmer air coming in along this warm front and back to the west, so snow changing to rain quite quickly here across the southwest coastal areas. And then for the day on Monday, that front weakens as it pushes eastward here. And look for a mix of precipitation pushing into the central interior with mainly rain here along the front to the south. Still very windy conditions here, southwest winds, coastal flood advisories and warnings out all along the coast here from Bristol Bay right up to the central Arctic coast. Snow and blowing snow there for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, and stays dry over the southeast interior with still pretty clear skies there. Clear weather, light winds all the way down the southeast coast. And for tomorrow for the south coast there, look for northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots and northeast winds 20 to 25 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, small craft advisories north at 30 knots, north at 20 for Stevens Passage, northeast 20 for Clarence Strait. And then for the day on Monday, inside waters here, north winds 15 to 20 knots. South coast, north winds 15 to 20 knots. North coast, north to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots with seas running 4 to 5 feet. Prince William Sound, light northwest wind at 10 knots. Cook Inlet, variable winds 10 knots or less. Slight seas. Northwest winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. And the western North Gulf Coast here, north at 20 knots. And then for Monday, western North Gulf Coast, west winds 30 knots, southwest 30 for the Barren Islands, southwest 25 for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, west to southwesterlies at 25 knots, and southeast winds at 10 knots for Prince William Sound. Eastern North Gulf Coast, not too bad on the winds there, south to southeast at 15 to 20 knots with seas at about 5 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow, anywhere from northwest to west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. West at 15 for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, west to northwesterlies 20 to 25 knots. And for the day on Monday, small craft advisories, Kodiak Island, southwesterlies at 25. Same thing for Bristol Bay, southwest 25 knots. And seas running 8 to 10 feet here for the Alaska Peninsula on the Bering Sea side. Pacific side, southwest at 30 knots with seas 9 to 10 feet. And for the western Aleutians tomorrow, good gales out there. South to southwest winds 40 knots, seas 17 to 22 feet. Adak and Atka, gale warning, south winds 35 knots with 14-foot seas. And the Fox Islands, small craft advisory, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the day on Monday here from Adak Island eastward across Unalaska Island, we've got west winds at 25 to 30 knots with 10 to 12-foot seas. And then west of Adak all the way out to Shimia, west winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, gale warnings, south winds 35 knots in all of those areas there with seas 11 feet here south of Nunivak Island, 7 feet Yukon Delta coast into Norton Sound, and then even stronger winds here and higher seas for St. Matthew Island, Pribilof, south winds 35 knots, seas 17 feet. And for the day on Monday, southwest 45 knot winds with seas around 25 feet for St. Matthew Island. Pribilof's west 35 knots, seas 18 feet. Southwest winds 30 knots, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, on down toward Cape Newenham. Gale warnings in Norton Sound for southwest winds at 35 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, variable winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming southeast at 15 for the central coast, small craft advisories. Western Arctic coast, south winds 25 knots, seas 5 feet. And the Chukchi Sea, very windy, southeast winds 40 knots with seas at 10 feet. And then for the day on Monday, still quite windy here for the Chukchi Sea with gale warnings out. South winds 35 to 40 knots with seas 10 to 15 feet. Western Arctic coast, south winds 30 knots, southwest 30 knots for the central coast, seas 6 to 9 feet through here. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 4 to 5 feet.